Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The humid Charleston morning of September 15th, 1928, brought with it more than the usual oppressive heat that clung to the cobblestone streets of the historic district. Dr. Harrison Pembroke, the city's chief medical examiner, received an urgent telegram that would forever alter his understanding of human nature and the capacity for calculated malevolence that could reside within the most unlikely of souls. The Ashford estate, a magnificent Georgian mansion that had stood sentinel over Trad Street for nearly 2 centuries, had become the center of an investigation that would challenge the very foundations of Charleston's genteel society. Within its walls, a family of considerable standing had met their end, in circumstances so peculiar that the local authorities found themselves grappling with questions that seemed to defy rational explanation. The telegram, delivered by a trembling messenger boy whose face bore the pallor of someone who had witnessed something beyond his years, contained only the most essential details. 3 members of the Ashford household had perished within the span of 18 months, each death initially attributed to natural causes, yet collectively forming a pattern that had finally drawn the attention of those trained to recognize the subtle signs of foul play. Dr. Pembroke's carriage rattled through the narrow streets as he made his way to the estate, his medical bag containing instruments that he hoped would provide answers to the growing list of questions that had begun to plague the investigation. The morning mist hung low over the Ashley River, creating an ethereal backdrop that seemed to mirror the uncertainty that shrouded the case. Upon arriving at the Ashford residence, Dr. Pembroke was struck by the imposing nature of the structure. The mansion's brick facade, weathered by decades of coastal storms and summer heat, bore the dignified scars of a building that had witnessed generations of Charleston's elite. Wrought iron balconies adorned the second floor, their intricate patterns casting shadows that danced across the morning light like spectral fingers reaching toward some unseen truth. The interior of the home revealed a family of considerable wealth and refinement. Oil paintings depicting stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their eyes seeming to follow visitors as they moved through the halls. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceiling medallions, creating an atmosphere of old-world elegance that made the recent tragedies all the more incongruous. Detective Captain William Forrester, a man whose weathered features spoke of decades spent pursuing justice through Charleston's darker corners, greeted Dr. Pembroke in the main foyer. The detective's notebook, already filled with observations and testimonies, would serve as the foundation for an investigation that would ultimately reveal the methodical nature of the crimes that had been committed within these walls. The first victim had been Margaret Ashford, the family matriarch, whose death in February of 1927 had been attributed to complications arising from a prolonged respiratory ailment. The second, her eldest son, Jonathan, had succumbed to what appeared to be a severe gastric disorder in August of the same year. The most recent death, that of daughter-in-law Catherine Ashford, had occurred just 3 weeks prior, with symptoms that initially suggested food poisoning, but had progressed in ways that defied conventional medical understanding. What connected these deaths, beyond their occurrence within the same household, was the presence of Theodore Crane, a young man of approximately 22 years who had been taken in by the Ashford family as an orphaned child some 15 years earlier. Theodore had been discovered as a 7-year-old vagrant, wandering the streets of Charleston's waterfront district with no memory of his origins or family name. The Ashfords, moved by Christian charity and perhaps by their own childless state at the time, had provided him with shelter, education, and the promise of a future that his circumstances would never have otherwise afforded. Dr. Pembroke's initial examination of the preserved tissue samples and medical records revealed subtle inconsistencies that had been overlooked during the initial investigations. The symptoms described by the attending physicians suggested the presence of substances that would not naturally occur in the human body, yet the primitive toxicological methods available at the time had failed to detect their presence. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Ashford estate, Dr. Pembroke found himself confronting the possibility that Charleston society was harboring a killer whose methods were as sophisticated as they were sinister. The investigation would require not only medical expertise, but also an understanding of the psychological forces that could drive someone to commit such calculated acts of violence against those who had shown them nothing but kindness. The case of Theodore Crane was about to begin in earnest. The Charleston City Archives, housed within a crumbling antebellum structure on Meeting Street, contained records that would prove instrumental in understanding the origins of Theodore Crane. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the elderly archivist whose meticulous nature had preserved decades of municipal documentation, had spent the better part of 3 days searching through yellowed ledgers and faded correspondence to piece together the fragmentary history of the young man who had become the focus of such intense scrutiny. The earliest official record of Theodore's existence dated to the winter of 1913, when he had been discovered by a night watchman near the Charleston harbor docks. The child, estimated to be no more than 7 years of age, had been found in a state of severe malnutrition and exposure, wearing clothes that suggested a background far removed from the poverty-stricken circumstances in which he was discovered. The fabric, though soiled and torn, bore the hallmarks of quality tailoring, leading investigators of the time to speculate that the boy had come from a family of some means. Dr. Pembroke's review of the medical records from the Charleston Foundling Hospital revealed disturbing details about Theodore's early psychological state. The attending physician, Dr. Nathaniel Grayson, had documented episodes of what he termed selective mutism and profound dissociation that persisted for nearly 6 months following the boy's discovery. More troubling still were the notes describing Theodore's apparent inability to recall any details of his life prior to his appearance at the docks, a condition that Dr. Grayson had attributed to severe psychological trauma. The Foundling Hospital's records indicated that Theodore had displayed remarkable intelligence despite his traumatic circumstances. Within months of his recovery, he had demonstrated an advanced capacity for reading and mathematical computation that far exceeded expectations for a child of his apparent background. The hospital's headmistress, Miss Victoria Caldwell, had noted in her reports that Theodore possessed an almost uncanny ability to observe and analyze the behavior of those around him, a trait that had initially been viewed as a positive sign of his intellectual recovery. What emerged from these early records was a portrait of a child who had learned to navigate his environment through careful observation and adaptation. Theodore had quickly identified the behaviors and responses that would earn him favor with the hospital staff, displaying a level of emotional manipulation that was sophisticated beyond his years. Miss Caldwell's later entries revealed a growing unease with the boy's ability to present different aspects of his personality depending upon his audience, though she had attributed this adaptability to the survival instincts developed during his unknown early trauma. The circumstances surrounding Theodore's adoption by the Ashford family in the spring of 1914 had been documented in correspondence between Miss Caldwell and Margaret Ashford. The letters revealed that Mrs. Ashford had been drawn to Theodore not only by his tragic circumstances, but also by his exceptional intelligence and apparent refinement. The boy had demonstrated knowledge of classical literature and music that suggested an education far beyond what would have been available to a child of common birth, yet he remained unable or unwilling to explain the source of this knowledge. Dr. Pembroke's investigation into Theodore's behavior during his early years with the Ashford family revealed a pattern of calculated charm and strategic positioning within the household hierarchy. Servants who had worked in the Ashford home during Theodore's childhood described a young man who had quickly ingratiated himself with each member of the family through careful attention to their individual preferences and vulnerabilities. The head butler, James Morrison, had noted in his private journal that Theodore possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the needs and desires of those around him. More disturbing were the accounts of small incidents that had occurred during Theodore's adolescence. Several household pets had died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths attributed at the time to various natural causes or accidents. A prized rose garden that had been Margaret Ashford's particular passion had withered and died despite the attention of experienced groundskeepers, the soil later found to contain unusual mineral deposits that defied explanation. The academic records from Theodore's private tutoring revealed a young man with particular interests in chemistry and botany, subjects in which he had excelled to a degree that had impressed even his most demanding instructors. His tutor, Professor Alexander Henley, had written extensively about Theodore's fascination with the properties of various plant compounds and their effects on living organisms, describing experiments that the young man had conducted with a level of scientific rigor that was remarkable for someone of his age. As Dr. Pembroke compiled these fragments of Theodore's history, a disturbing picture began to emerge of a young man whose intelligence and charm masked a calculating nature that had been developing since his earliest years within the Ashford household. The winter of 1927 had been particularly harsh for Charleston, bringing with it an unusual succession of cold fronts that left the city's residents struggling with respiratory ailments that seemed to linger far beyond their typical duration. Margaret Ashford, at 63 years of age, had always prided herself on her robust constitution, making her sudden decline in health all the more alarming to those who knew her well. Dr. Pembroke's examination of Margaret's medical records revealed a progression of symptoms that had initially appeared consistent with influenza, but had evolved in ways that defied conventional understanding. The attending physician, Dr. Reginald Hartley, had documented a series of treatments that had provided temporary relief, only to be followed by increasingly severe relapses that seemed to occur in cyclical patterns. The household staff had noted that Margaret's illness had coincided with Theodore's increased attention to her care. The young man, now 22, and having completed his education under private tutors, had taken upon himself the responsibility of ensuring his adoptive mother's comfort during her convalescence. He had personally prepared her meals, administered her medications, and maintained a vigilant presence at her bedside that had been viewed by the family as evidence of his deep gratitude and affection. Mrs. Florence Hartwell, the Ashford family's longtime housekeeper, had maintained detailed records of the household's daily activities during Margaret's illness. Her meticulous notes revealed that Theodore had developed an extensive knowledge of herbal remedies and medicinal preparations, often supplementing the doctor's prescribed treatments with concoctions of his own devising. These preparations, which Theodore claimed to have learned from botanical texts in the family's extensive library, were administered with a frequency and precision that impressed even Dr. Hartley. The symptoms that had characterized Margaret's final weeks were particularly troubling when viewed through the lens of Dr. Pembroke's investigation. The patient had experienced periods of severe gastrointestinal distress, alternating with episodes of respiratory difficulty that seemed to respond temporarily to Theodore's herbal treatments before returning with increased severity. Her mental state had also deteriorated, with periods of confusion and disorientation that had been attributed to the effects of prolonged illness and the various medications being administered. Dr. Pembroke's review of the preserved tissue samples from Margaret's autopsy revealed traces of alkaloid compounds that had not been identified during the original examination. The primitive toxicological methods available in 1927 had been insufficient to detect the presence of these substances, which appeared to be derived from plant sources that were not commonly associated with medicinal preparations. The concentrations found in the tissue samples suggested a pattern of administration that would have produced the cyclical symptoms documented in Dr. Hartley's records. The botanical knowledge that Theodore had demonstrated during Margaret's illness became a focal point of Dr. Pembroke's investigation. The young man's private study, located on the third floor of the Ashford mansion, contained an extensive collection of texts on plant chemistry and toxicology that far exceeded what would be expected for someone with merely academic interests in botany. Many of these volumes contained detailed annotations in Theodore's precise handwriting, with particular attention paid to chapters dealing with the extraction and concentration of plant-based alkaloids. More disturbing still was the discovery of a private greenhouse that Theodore had constructed in a secluded corner of the estate's gardens. This structure, hidden from casual observation by carefully positioned hedgerows, contained specimens of plants that were not native to the Charleston region and would have required considerable effort and expense to obtain. Many of these specimens were known to contain compounds that could produce symptoms similar to those experienced by Margaret during her final illness. The greenhouse also contained an elaborate apparatus for the distillation and concentration of plant extracts, equipment that demonstrated a level of sophistication that suggested years of careful study and experimentation. Laboratory notebooks found within the structure documented Theodore's methodical approach to understanding the properties and effects of various plant compounds, with particular attention paid to dosage calculations and methods of administration that would minimize detection. The timing of Margaret's death had occurred during a period when Theodore's botanical experiments appeared to have reached a level of sophistication that would have enabled him to produce compounds capable of mimicking natural disease processes. The young man's position within the household had provided him with unlimited access to Margaret's food and medications, while his reputation as a devoted caregiver had deflected any suspicion that might otherwise have arisen from his constant presence during her illness. As Dr. Pembroke compiled his findings regarding Margaret Ashford's death, the evidence pointed toward a level of premeditation and scientific knowledge that transformed what had appeared to be a tragic but natural death into something far more sinister. The death of Jonathan Ashford in August of 1927 had occurred during the height of Charleston's oppressive summer heat, when the city's residents often fell victim to various gastric ailments brought on by spoiled food and contaminated water sources. At 38 years of age, Jonathan had been the pillar of the family's cotton trading business, a man whose robust health and vigorous constitution had made his sudden illness all the more shocking to those who knew him. Dr. Pembroke's examination of Jonathan's medical records revealed a pattern of symptoms that had initially been attributed to acute gastroenteritis, a common affliction during the summer months. However, the progression of his illness displayed characteristics that were inconsistent with typical food poisoning or bacterial infection. The attending physician, Dr. Charles Beaumont, had documented a series of treatments that had provided no lasting relief, with Jonathan's condition deteriorating in a manner that defied conventional medical understanding. The onset of Jonathan's illness had coincided with his increased involvement in the family's business affairs following his mother's death 6 months earlier. Theodore had taken upon himself the role of managing the household's domestic arrangements, a responsibility that included overseeing the preparation of meals and the maintenance of Jonathan's personal quarters. The young man's attention to these duties had been viewed by the remaining family members as evidence of his commitment to preserving the stability of the household during a period of grief and transition. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, the family's cook, had noted in her personal correspondence that Theodore had begun taking an active interest in the preparation of Jonathan's meals, often suggesting modifications to recipes based on his understanding of digestive health and nutritional requirements. These suggestions, which Theodore claimed to have derived from medical texts in the family's library, were implemented with the goal of supporting Jonathan's recovery from the stress and exhaustion that had followed his mother's death. The symptoms that characterized Jonathan's final weeks were particularly disturbing when examined through the lens of Dr. Pembroke's investigation. The patient had experienced severe abdominal cramping, accompanied by episodes of nausea and vomiting that seemed to occur in patterns that defied medical explanation. His mental state had also been affected, with periods of confusion and disorientation that had been attributed to dehydration and the effects of prolonged illness. Dr. Pembroke's analysis of the preserved tissue samples from Jonathan's autopsy revealed the presence of compounds that had not been identified during the original examination. These substances appeared to be derived from plant sources that were known to affect the digestive system in ways that could mimic the symptoms of severe gastric distress. The concentrations found in the tissue samples suggested a pattern of administration that would have produced the progressive deterioration documented in Dr. Beaumont's records. The investigation into Theodore's activities during Jonathan's illness revealed a level of involvement that extended far beyond what would be expected from a concerned family member. The young man had maintained detailed records of Jonathan's symptoms and treatments, documenting the effects of various remedies with a precision that suggested scientific rather than merely compassionate interest. These records, found among Theodore's personal papers, contained observations about dosage timing and symptom progression that demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the relationship between cause and effect. More troubling still was the discovery that Theodore had been conducting correspondence with botanical suppliers in distant cities, ordering specimens and extracts that were not readily available through local sources. The invoices and shipping records revealed a pattern of acquisitions that had accelerated in the months following Margaret's death, suggesting that Jonathan's illness had been planned with considerable forethought and preparation. The greenhouse facility that Theodore had constructed continued to serve as the center of his botanical experiments during this period. Laboratory notebooks from the summer of 1927 documented his research into compounds that could produce gastric symptoms while remaining undetectable through conventional medical examination. The sophistication of his experimental methods had advanced considerably since his earlier work, with detailed protocols for extraction, purification, and administration that demonstrated a level of expertise that would have been remarkable in a trained chemist. The timing of Jonathan's death had occurred at a moment when Theodore's position within the family hierarchy had become more secure. With Margaret's passing, the young man had assumed greater responsibility for household management, while Jonathan's illness had created opportunities for Theodore to demonstrate his indispensability to the family's continued functioning. The death had also resulted in significant changes to the family's financial arrangements, with Theodore being named as a beneficiary in Jonathan's will, a gesture that had been intended to recognize his years of loyal service to the household. As Dr. Pembroke compiled his findings regarding Jonathan Ashford's death, the evidence pointed toward a systematic campaign of elimination that was being conducted with scientific precision and psychological manipulation. The death of Catherine Ashford in late August of 1928 marked the culmination of what Dr. Pembroke had come to recognize as a methodical campaign of elimination that had been conducted with chilling precision over the course of 18 months. Catherine, who had married into the Ashford family just 3 years prior, represented the final obstacle to Theodore's complete control over the family's considerable estate and social standing within Charleston's elite circles. At 29 years of age, Catherine had brought to the marriage not only her own modest inheritance, but also a sharp intellect and keen observational skills that had made her uniquely positioned to notice the subtle patterns that had escaped the attention of other family members. Her background as the daughter of a prominent physician had provided her with sufficient medical knowledge to question some of the treatments and remedies that Theodore had been administering to the household during the various illnesses that had plagued the family. Dr. Pembroke's examination of Catherine's personal correspondence revealed growing concerns about the circumstances surrounding the deaths of her mother-in-law and husband. Letters written to her sister in Savannah during the weeks preceding her own death contained veiled references to suspicions that she had been unable to voice openly within the household. These letters, discovered among her personal effects, suggested that Catherine had begun to recognize patterns in the timing and progression of the illnesses that had claimed the lives of Margaret and Jonathan. The onset of Catherine's final illness had occurred during a period when she had been making discreet inquiries into the family's medical history and the various treatments that had been employed during the previous deaths. Her symptoms had initially manifested as what appeared to be a mild digestive upset, similar to the early stages of Jonathan's illness, but had progressed with a rapidity that had alarmed even Dr. Beaumont, who had attended all 3 family members during their final illnesses. Theodore's response to Catherine's illness had demonstrated the same pattern of devoted attention that had characterized his care for Margaret and Jonathan. However, Catherine's medical background had made her more resistant to his suggestions regarding treatment, leading to a subtle but noticeable tension within the household as she had begun to question the efficacy and necessity of some of his proposed remedies. The investigation into Catherine's death revealed that Theodore had modified his methods in response to her increased vigilance. Rather than relying solely on the herbal preparations that had proven effective with previous victims, he had begun incorporating compounds that would produce more rapid and dramatic effects. The laboratory notebooks from this period documented his research into alkaloids that could mimic the symptoms of acute food poisoning while remaining undetectable through the limited toxicological methods available to local physicians. Dr. Pembroke's analysis of the tissue samples from Catherine's autopsy revealed the presence of multiple plant-derived toxins that had been administered in concentrations designed to overwhelm her body's natural defenses. Unlike the previous deaths, which had been characterized by gradual deterioration over weeks or months, Catherine's poisoning had been conducted with an urgency that suggested Theodore's awareness that his activities were beginning to attract unwanted attention. The circumstances surrounding Catherine's death had also revealed the extent to which Theodore had been manipulating the household staff and medical professionals involved in the family's care. His ability to present himself as a grieving family member while simultaneously directing the course of treatment had enabled him to maintain control over the narrative surrounding each death. The trust that he had cultivated over years of apparent devotion had provided him with the perfect cover for his systematic elimination of the family members who stood between him and complete control of the Ashford legacy. The financial implications of Catherine's death had been substantial, as her passing had eliminated the last direct heir to the Ashford fortune aside from Theodore himself. The will that Jonathan had executed following his mother's death had named Theodore as the primary beneficiary in the event that Catherine predeceased him, a provision that had been intended to ensure the continuity of the family's charitable works and business interests. The document had been drafted during a period when Theodore's devotion to the family had been viewed as evidence of his worthiness to serve as steward of their legacy. Dr. Pembroke's investigation had also revealed that Theodore had been making preparations for his eventual departure from Charleston, with correspondence indicating plans to relocate to a distant city where his past would not be subject to scrutiny. Bank records showed that he had been systematically liquidating family assets and transferring funds to accounts that would be accessible to him regardless of any future legal complications that might arise from his activities. The pattern of deaths within the Ashford household had finally attracted the attention of authorities who possessed the knowledge and resources necessary to recognize the sophisticated nature of the crimes that had been committed. Theodore's reign of terror was approaching its end, though the full extent of his psychological manipulation and scientific expertise would only become apparent through the detailed investigation that was now underway. The methodical nature of Dr. Pembroke's investigation had begun to reveal the true scope of Theodore's activities within the Ashford household, extending far beyond the 3 documented deaths to encompass a web of manipulation and control that had been developing for over a decade. The evidence that emerged from detailed examination of household records, financial documents, and personal correspondence painted a portrait of a young man whose intelligence had been channeled toward the systematic destruction of the family that had provided him with shelter and opportunity. Detective Captain Forrester's interviews with former household staff revealed a pattern of subtle intimidation and psychological manipulation that had enabled Theodore to maintain control over potential witnesses to his activities. Several servants who had worked in the Ashford home during the period of the deaths had left their positions under circumstances that they had been reluctant to discuss, citing vague concerns about the atmosphere within the household following Margaret's death. The investigation into Theodore's financial activities revealed a sophisticated understanding of estate law and inheritance procedures that suggested extensive research into the legal mechanisms that would ensure his control over the family's assets. Bank records showed that he had been making strategic investments and establishing accounts that would provide him with financial security, regardless of the outcome of any future legal proceedings. These preparations demonstrated a level of foresight that indicated his crimes had been planned with meticulous attention to detail. Dr. Pembroke's examination of the greenhouse facility had uncovered evidence of experiments that extended far beyond the production of the toxins used in the 3 confirmed poisonings. Laboratory equipment found within the structure suggested that Theodore had been conducting research into a wide range of plant-based compounds, including several that were known to produce psychological effects rather than physical symptoms. The implications of this research were particularly disturbing, as they suggested that Theodore's victims may have been subjected to mental manipulation in addition to physical poisoning. The discovery of detailed journals hidden within Theodore's private study provided unprecedented insight into the psychological motivations that had driven his campaign of elimination. These documents, written in a cipher that required considerable effort to decode, revealed a young man who viewed his adoptive family not as benefactors, but as obstacles to his rightful inheritance of their wealth and social position. The entries documented his growing resentment toward the family members who had shown him kindness, describing them in terms that suggested he viewed their affection as a form of condescension that needed to be punished. More troubling still were the entries that described Theodore's experimental approach to the poisonings, treating each death as an opportunity to refine his methods and test new compounds. The journals revealed that he had viewed Margaret's death as a preliminary experiment, using her illness to perfect his techniques before moving on to more challenging targets. Jonathan's death had been conducted with greater confidence, while Catherine's poisoning had been executed with the precision of someone who had mastered his craft through careful practice and observation. The investigation into Theodore's educational background revealed that his tutors had been unaware of the extent to which he had been supplementing their instruction with independent research into subjects that were far removed from conventional academic curricula. Library records from institutions throughout the region showed that Theodore had been accessing texts on toxicology, chemistry, and psychology that would have been considered advanced, even for university-level students. His ability to absorb and apply this knowledge had been facilitated by an intellect that was exceptional, even by the standards of Charleston's educated elite. Dr. Pembroke's analysis of the timeline surrounding the three deaths revealed that Theodore had been conducting what amounted to a controlled experiment in human elimination, with each death providing data that informed his approach to subsequent victims. The intervals between deaths had been carefully calculated to avoid arousing suspicion, while allowing sufficient time for the effects of previous crimes to be forgotten or attributed to natural causes. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation suggested that Theodore's crimes had been motivated not merely by greed, but by a profound sense of entitlement that had been developing since his earliest years within the Ashford household. His ability to present himself as a devoted family member while simultaneously planning their destruction indicated a level of psychological dissociation that was remarkable even among documented cases of serial poisoning. As the investigation continued to uncover evidence of Theodore's activities, it became clear that the three confirmed deaths represented only the visible portion of a campaign of terror that had been conducted with scientific precision and psychological sophistication that challenged conventional understanding of criminal behavior. The morning of October 3rd, 1928, brought with it the culmination of Dr. Pembroke's investigation as authorities prepared to confront Theodore Crane with the evidence that had been methodically assembled over the preceding weeks. The young man's daily routine had continued unchanged, despite the increasing scrutiny surrounding the Ashford deaths. A demonstration of either remarkable composure or profound psychological detachment that had impressed even the experienced investigators involved in the case. Theodore's behavior during the final weeks of the investigation had revealed subtle changes that suggested an awareness of the closing net around him. Household staff reported that he had begun spending increasing amounts of time in his private study, often working late into the night on projects that he had been reluctant to discuss. The sound of papers being burned in the fireplace had become a regular occurrence, indicating that Theodore was systematically destroying evidence that might prove incriminating. Detective Captain Forrester's surveillance of the Ashford estate had documented Theodore's attempts to dispose of materials from his greenhouse laboratory. Under cover of darkness, the young man had been observed burying containers and equipment in remote corners of the estate's extensive grounds. The recovery of these items had provided additional evidence of the sophisticated nature of his experimental activities, including apparatus for the distillation of plant extracts that demonstrated a level of technical expertise that exceeded what would be expected from someone with merely academic interests in botany. The psychological assessment conducted by Dr. Pembroke had revealed that Theodore possessed an unusual combination of intellectual brilliance and emotional detachment that had enabled him to conduct his crimes with scientific precision while maintaining the facade of a devoted family member. His ability to compartmentalize his activities suggested a form of psychological dissociation that was rarely encountered even among documented cases of serial poisoning. The evidence gathered during the investigation had painted a portrait of a young man who had spent years carefully studying the vulnerabilities and weaknesses of his adoptive family members, identifying the most effective methods for eliminating each target while minimizing the risk of detection. His knowledge of their medical histories, dietary preferences, and daily routines had provided him with the information necessary to conduct his poisonings with maximum effectiveness. The financial records that had been uncovered during the investigation revealed the extent to which Theodore had been preparing for his eventual inheritance of the Ashford estate. Legal documents showed that he had been consulting with attorneys regarding the probate process and the transfer of assets, demonstrating a level of planning that extended far beyond the immediate execution of his crimes. Bank records indicated that he had been establishing financial arrangements that would provide him with access to the family's wealth regardless of any legal complications that might arise from his activities. Dr. Pembroke's analysis of Theodore's psychological state had suggested that the young man viewed his crimes not as acts of murder, but as the logical resolution of what he perceived to be an unjust situation. The journals that had been discovered in his study revealed a worldview in which he saw himself as the rightful heir to the Ashford legacy, with the family members who had adopted him serving merely as temporary obstacles to his inheritance. The investigation had also revealed that Theodore had been making preparations for his departure from Charleston, with correspondence indicating plans to relocate to a distant city where his past would not be subject to scrutiny. Travel arrangements had been made under an assumed name, and financial assets had been transferred to accounts that would be accessible to him regardless of his location. As the authorities prepared to confront Theodore with the evidence of his crimes, the young man's demeanor remained remarkably composed. His daily routine continued unchanged, with regular visits to his greenhouse laboratory and extended periods spent in his private study. The staff reported that he had maintained his usual courteous manner toward household employees, showing no signs of the stress or anxiety that would be expected from someone facing imminent exposure. The confrontation that was about to take place would test Theodore's psychological defenses against the overwhelming evidence that had been assembled through weeks of meticulous investigation. The outcome would determine whether his remarkable composure was genuine or merely another manifestation of the psychological manipulation that had characterized his entire relationship with the Ashford family. The dawn of October 4th, 1928, revealed an empty mansion and a mystery that would haunt Charleston's collective memory for generations to come. When Detective Captain Forrester and his team arrived at the Ashford estate to execute the warrant for Theodore's arrest, they discovered that the young man had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the carefully arranged evidence of his crimes and a final demonstration of the meticulous planning that had characterized his entire campaign of elimination. The household staff reported that Theodore had retired to his quarters at his usual hour the previous evening, showing no signs of agitation or awareness of the impending confrontation. His bed had been slept in, his personal effects remained undisturbed, and his morning coffee had been prepared according to his customary routine. Yet somewhere between the midnight hour and dawn, Theodore Crane had simply ceased to exist within the confines of the estate that had been his home for nearly 15 years. Dr. Pembroke's examination of Theodore's private study revealed that the young man had left behind a comprehensive record of his activities, arranged with the same scientific precision that had characterized his poisoning experiments. Laboratory notebooks documenting his research into plant-based toxins had been placed prominently on his desk, along with detailed charts showing the progression of symptoms experienced by each of his victims. The materials appeared to have been deliberately organized to facilitate the investigation, as if Theodore had intended his methods to be understood and perhaps even admired by those who would eventually uncover them. The greenhouse facility had been similarly prepared for discovery, with specimens and equipment arranged in a manner that demonstrated the sophistication of Theodore's botanical research. Chemical apparatus had been cleaned and catalogued, while detailed notes explained the extraction and concentration processes that had been used to produce the toxins responsible for the 3 deaths. The precision of these preparations suggested that Theodore had viewed his crimes as scientific achievements worthy of documentation and preservation. More disturbing still was the discovery of additional journals that revealed the true scope of Theodore's psychological manipulation of the Ashford family. These documents detailed his systematic study of each family member's personality, documenting their fears, desires, and vulnerabilities with the detachment of a naturalist observing specimens in a laboratory. The entries revealed that Theodore had been conducting what amounted to psychological experiments on his adoptive family for years before beginning his campaign of physical elimination. The financial investigation revealed that Theodore had executed his departure with the same meticulous planning that had characterized his crimes. Bank records showed that substantial sums had been withdrawn from accounts under his control during the weeks preceding his disappearance, while legal documents indicated that he had arranged for the transfer of remaining assets to charitable institutions, effectively eliminating any financial trail that might facilitate his pursuit. Detective Captain Forrester's investigation into Theodore's escape route revealed evidence of preparation that extended back months before his disappearance. Travel documents had been obtained under multiple assumed identities, while correspondence with contacts in distant cities suggested that he had been establishing the foundation for a new life, far removed from Charleston's social circles. The sophistication of these arrangements indicated that Theodore had anticipated the eventual discovery of his crimes and had prepared accordingly. The search for Theodore extended throughout the southeastern states and beyond, but no trace of the young man was ever discovered. His ability to vanish so completely suggested a level of planning and resource management that exceeded even the impressive capabilities he had demonstrated in conducting his poisoning campaign. The investigation gradually expanded to encompass a network of contacts and financial arrangements that revealed Theodore's remarkable ability to manipulate systems and individuals to serve his purposes. As the months passed without any sign of Theodore's whereabouts, the case began to take on an almost mythical quality within Charleston's social circles. The young man who had been welcomed into one of the city's most prominent families had systematically destroyed his benefactors before disappearing into the anonymity that had characterized his origins. The circular nature of his story, beginning and ending in mystery, seemed to reflect the fundamental unknowability of the psychological forces that had driven his crimes. The Ashford estate, now empty of both victims and perpetrator, stood as a monument to the capacity for evil that could reside within the most unlikely of individuals. The case files, preserved in the Charleston Police Department's archives, would serve as a reminder that the most dangerous predators were often those who appeared most harmless, and that the greatest threats to human safety sometimes emerged from within the very institutions designed to provide protection and nurture. Theodore Crane had vanished, but his legacy of calculated malevolence would endure as a testament to the darkest possibilities of human nature. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.